All right, so we're almost done with the lecture. I just wanted to throw this in here just because it's kind of relevant for sensation and perception when we're talking about pathways and vision. And I do see this pop up decently often, sometimes on multiple sections of the MCAT. So we're going to talk about the two different types of thresholds that usually come up. Um, I know some of you have probably seen this even in psychology when you do perception for cognitive psych. So the absolute threshold is the minimum intensity needed by a stimulus to activate a sensory receptor 50% of the time. So that means um, it is how you can detect that a stimulus is present, the minimum amount of stimulus intensity that is needed for you to be able to recognize that the stimulus is present 50% of the time. That's considered the absolute threshold. So anything under it, you're pretty much not going to be able to recognize it. Anything over it, you'll be able to recognize it because 50% is that sort of that chance number. Anything over it is not by chance. Anything under it, again, is not by chance. And the difference threshold is just comparing two different stimuli or a change in the stimuli. Is that related to the absolute refractory period for the action potential? I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, you might be able to draw some parallels between the two. The absolute refractory period just basically has to do with the inactivation of the sodium channels. And then just the complete hyperpolarization of the membrane, where this absolute threshold is, I mean, I guess you can kind of relate them because it does have to do with action potentials. They're sort of paralleled. Yeah, I would say they're sort of parallel because it does depend. You need 50%. Activating a sensory receptor 50% of the time would require the action potential to fire. So it's a good idea. You can draw those parallels if that helps you remember them. And the difference threshold is another threshold, but it's not just we're not just detecting a stimulus. We're detecting a change in a present stimulus, or we are distinguishing between two different stimuli. And it's also known as the just noticeable difference. I think I've actually seen that terminology more often on the MCAT. And that's actually usually the threshold that I see because you have this nifty little law called Weber's law that gets a little bit quantitative, and they like to test it because it's one of those simple laws where they'll throw numbers at you and you should be able to do it without a calculator. So Weber's law is delta I over I equals K, which is pretty simple. Delta I is the actual difference threshold. So that is the difference between the initial stimulus and the change. It's the actual change is the difference threshold. And I'll explain it in a minute. I is the initial intensity of the stimulus and K is the constant value. So if you have, say, a weight that's 1 pound, and you take another weight that's you add 0.2 pounds to it. Maybe you don't feel the difference when you add 1.2 pounds to it. You add 1.3 pounds, you finally feel it. So the delta I, the difference threshold, is going to be 0.3 because that is the difference at which we can finally distinguish the difference between the two stimuli. Yeah, so, and then I is the initial intensity of the stimulus and K is a constant value. So if you have the same thing, if you have those weights and you increase them, say instead of starting with 1 pound, you start with 30 pounds. That means that the delta I is going to change. But if you take that delta I and you divide it by the original I, that K value is going to be the same as if the I was 1, if the I was 10, if the I was 100.
So quick question. Sorry,
Yep.
this is Taja. So
Mhm.
different show, like I'm a very visual person. So I'm kind of and like experienced kind of teacher.
Yep.
So kind of like warm, the difference between warm and like that will burn my skin off, kind of like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Temperature is definitely something that can be measured with Weber's law. Yeah. That's actually very interesting because I don't see that too often. I usually see it with weight or sound. So Opal said, will the units
Okay.
be log scale like decibels? Yeah, I mean, they will use decibels. Sometimes I think I've even seen them use just like absolute units for sound, like even just like made up units. Um, but I often see Weber's law used with pounds or some sort of weight. just because I think it's just easier,
Yeah.
because they know you don't have a calculator, so they want to give you something that you're capable of doing in your head. Um, so for all recorded values of I and delta I, K will remain constant.